Hi, I'm Kristin Omdahl and welcome back to my studio. In this series of videos, we're going to walk step by step through the fundamentals of reading crochet charts. Please follow each of the videos as each one will go through a different component that you will need to be successful at reading crochet charts. Let's get started. I think it's really important to see a variety of different samples when learning something new. Currently, I'm writing my 18th book, and I thought it might be fun to go through some of my older books today and show you a variety of different samples of motif projects because I've always written my patterns with charts. Today we're going to be focusing on the join as you go component to crochet motifs. First pattern I'm going to show you is from my first book, Wrapped in Crochet, and it's the Fara Shawl. And this has squares and triangles that are joined as you go. So notice a couple of things in this chart to begin with. We've got our stitch key. We also have some motifs that are written out completely, and then we have some motifs that only show the last round. When you're making the first motif, you need to see all of the rounds, but when you're joining the motifs together, the only thing you need to focus on at that point is the joining round or the final round. So what you'll see here is that there is a slip stitch join in these, and you go back to your chart, symbols or the keys, the stitch key for the pattern, and it shows you that that dot stands for the slip stitch, which you would know already because you've watched the other videos and you've downloaded your stitch guide. That slip stitch replaces the chain that is done on the original motif. The original motif ends that final round with double crochet, chain one, double crochet. Well, a slip stitch replaces one chain when you're joining to other motifs. So the few things that we're going to focus on with this one is that they're joining because you only see that final round, which is optional. Some patterns will show you all of the rounds when you're looking at them being joined. But then the next thing to pay attention to is how they're joined. And notice on this one, we're joined with a slip stitch in the V stitches across that row. Let's look at another, and then you can see that that's also the case with the triangle one here. If you are a right-hand crocheter, remember that you're reading these counterclockwise, and if you are a left-hand crocheter, you are reading these clockwise. Next pattern I want to show you is the Mary Shawl from Motif Magic. And in this chart, we're joining square motifs and triangle motifs again, just like in the previous one. And you can see from this pattern, it tells you in the diagram where you're placing the triangle motifs and where you're placing the square motifs. So when you're joining motifs together, you not only will be joining them on one side, but sometimes you'll be joining them on two sides as well. So notice how on this chart here, we're showing you the arrows to show you exactly where those slip stitches are going. So we've got a slip stitch here that counts as our third of a chain 5 space. Notice that the outer round on these motifs is a chain 5 space. So to slip stitch to join them, we're replacing one chain, the center chain, so it's chain 2, slip stitch, chain 2 into that chain 5 space. So this motif here is joined on two sides. So starting on here, we're joining across this way and then joining across that way. Next, I'm going to show you a pattern from Layers Crochet, and this is the Sally Cardi Wrap Vest. In this particular pattern, we're joining strips, so they're not squares or triangles. They're not motifs per se, they're strips of fabric. But the concept of joining as you go is perfectly fine with any type of a fabric, whether it's a small piece or a long strip. You're still replacing a stitch or a chain with a slip stitch to join it to an adjacent piece. So notice here we've got long strips, and then we've got the shorter strips which give us armholes, and then long strips again so that we can create that cardi vest. The first chart here tells you how to make one strip, and the yellow shading tells you what area you're repeating. And then when you're joining them together, this one's joined a little differently. We're not replacing a stitch or a chain, we're adding. And that's because we're working in a solid fabric here, a solid fabric of 5 treble crochets on the exterior round on each of the strips. So there isn't a stitch to replace. If you replaced one of those stitches with a slip stitch, you wouldn't have the 5 stitches that you need. So we're slip stitching to the adjacent center stitch on the previous or on the adjacent strip. So you did 5 treble crochets on this one, so as you're coming around on the second one and joining it, you'd work 1, 2, 3 treble crochets, slip stitch to the 3rd treble crochet on the adjacent strip, then work your 2 more treble crochets and continue on in the pattern. So sometimes the slip stitch is additional, it's not necessarily replacing. And that's an exception because most of the lacier ones you're replacing. Next I'll show you a project from 80 Handmade Gifts. So this is the Marlene bag from 80 Handmade Gifts, and these are square motifs. And you'll see on here that we have them with slip stitches. So there's double crochet, chain 1, double crochet in the corner sections here, and so on the adjacent motif we replace those chain 1 spaces with a slip stitch. So we're going to slip stitch to the chain 1 space and then come back and work in our original motif, the one that we're working on. Into the adjacent motif's chain 5 space, we're going to replace that 3rd chain with a slip stitch. Now when you're working in the sides of motifs, you can either work that slip stitch into the specific 3rd chain of that chain 5 space, or you can work it right into the big large space of the chain 5 space. Either way works. I only suggest that you stay consistent in whichever way you choose to do it. When you're working into corners, and I'll show you that on another example, it's more important to work into the center chain, and I'll show you that on another example. Let's go back to the Mary shawl, which was from Motif Magic, and these are the square motifs that we joined together, and we replaced some of the chains with a slip stitch in the corners of this motif. Let's go back to the chart actually to really see this side by side. Okay, yeah, so we had a chain 7 space in the corners here, and on the joining motifs we did a chain 3 slip stitch, chain 3, and so instead of just slip stitching into the chain 7 space, we slip stitched into the center. Well, what would be the center of chain 7? It would be the 4th chain. So on the other 3 motifs that are all joined into the original, you have your original, and then each time you join another one, you want to always join it into that first one. So it was chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, and then continue on with that motif. Then when you came down to this motif, it was chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, and continued on with that motif. And then for the corner on the 4th motif, it was chain 3, slip stitch into that same chain, chain 3, and look at how tight and neat that join ends up being because it's joined into the same exact chain. Here's an example in the chain 5 spaces along the sides where I joined just into the open space of the chain 5 space. We were only joining one time between the 2 sides. I'll show you that here again in this section here and here. Because you were only joining one time, it wasn't necessary to work into a specific chain, but you could if you wanted to. Okay, here's another example of a motif project. And this one's a little bit different. This one is felted motifs, and they're joined the same way, but I just wanted to show you that it's another example of a different way to do it. This project's from Crochet So Lovely. Here's the finished photo of it, and we'll come across to the chart, and you can see, okay, so we've got our first motif and then our join, and then this is where we're only showing here's our original motif in the center, and then here's the outer round of 2 other motifs to show how we join them together. Notice how we're joining a little bit differently this time. Like I said before, we've got rules and then we've got exceptions to the rules. So here in the chain 5 space corners, we replace the chain 5 with a chain 2 slip stitch, chain 2 for joining in the corners. But look at here, for the chain 5 spaces, we replaced the chain 5 with a chain 2 single crochet chain 2. So we join with a single crochet, not a slip stitch, but notice how it still replaces that third chain of the chain 5 space. And I'll show you that again on here. Once it's felted, it's near impossible to really show you the detail, but our corners are somewhere around there. Okay, I want to show you this one. Let's show you a project from Continuous Crochet. Here we go. This is the Isle of Capri pullover, another kind of a mesh type of a motif, so we'll definitely be joining in the spaces. And this one, again, we've got our first motif that has all of our interior rounds shown in the chart, and then on the joining motifs, we're showing how you join on the outer round only. Now, notice also in this one, it tells you this motif is joined on one side, this motif is joined on one side, and this motif is joined on two sides. So as you're joining a fabric together, you've got your first motif that's just made all by itself. Then the very next motif you make can only be joined on one side. If you joined it on two sides, it wouldn't be a flat fabric anymore. That would become a bowl or a hat or something altogether different. So you would join your second motif here. When joining your third motif, it is also a one-sided join to keep the fabric flat. So as you're coming around, you're going to join, it's a slip stitch replacing the center chain in each of the sections across. And then our fourth motif, so every time you are creating a fabric, eventually you come to a fourth motif or whatever ends up filling up that squared off flat fabric, and you're going to be joining on two sides. So you're working your way around, you're joining along the one side the same way you join on one-sided joins. The only difference is when you come to the end of that row, end of that round, you're going to continue on joining on the second side of it, but it will be joining to a different motif now. So when we're doing a two-sided join, we join this side to this motif, and then as we're working around, you're joining to a different motif for the second side. That can get a little bit confusing, and I'm going to show you that on this fabric again. So when you're doing that, let's say you're coming along, let's use this one on the edge as example. Let's say we're making this motif and we forget this because it looks like we're three-sided joined, and that's only because we continued on further in the fabric. So let's pretend this isn't made yet and you needed to add this motif to fill out this fabric. So it would have been a two-sided join at that point. So as you're coming along here, making your motif, you're coming along here and joining on this side. If you're confused about where to go from there, it's always a good idea to lay your fabric down flat to make sure that it makes sense for where to go next. Sometimes that can be extremely confusing, especially when you're brand new to joining motifs together. The best advice I can give is to always set your work down flat on a surface, and then it will really make a lot more sense as to where to go next. Okay, in Crochet So Fine, we had some motif projects as well. Here we go. Here's the Starry Nights wrap. Really pretty star-shaped motif. And you'll see here in the chart, it shows you all the rounds for the first motif, and then it tells you how many different places you're joining for the other motifs, which, like we said before, one-sided, two-sided joins. This second motif has 2 points that are joined together, so after you make the first one, you're going to come around making the second one and join in 2 of the corners to the previous motif, and notice the chain 3 space is replaced with a chain 1 slip stitch to join chain 1, and it's done in 2 places. These are hexagon motifs, not square, so they're 6-sided, and we're joining them offset, so it means that there are more places to join them. So we have 3-sided join, we have 1, 2, 3, 4-sided joins. So depending on where you are in a project like this, there are more places to join. So let's say we did this one. Our second motif was the 2-point join here and here. Then you come down to this one, and this one's going to will need to be joined in 3 places. So we're coming around, And remember, we don't have the rest of this done yet. We only have those two done. So you want to try to focus on what you're supposed to see first, right? So 3 pointed joins, so you're coming around, and we're going to join here, here, and here. And remember my tip earlier, when you're joining more than one time into the same space, it's a good idea to work into the individual chain, not the open chain space. So that was a 3 pointed join. So then the 4 pointed join, we'd be working this motif, coming around, we join in this point, this point, this point, and this point. Again, working counterclockwise if you're right-handed and clockwise if you're left-handed. If you have any questions about this video, please leave them for me in the comments, and make sure you watch all of the videos in this playlist so you can learn all the fundamentals step by step for how to read crochet charts. Let us make time to create, share, and inspire today and every day. I'll see you in the next video.